Hello everyone, Shirley here, and welcome to my 10.0 Arms Warrior Guide. We're going to be going over a few specs today and talents to show off multiple ways you can play your Arms Warrior. There's a couple of viable specs, somewhat, coming up. There's two predominant ones, a single target and AOE build that we're going to be taking a look at. But as I tend to extend these guides quite a bit, I'm going to do a quick TLDR version here at the beginning for the people that don't want to stick around for the whole thing. But I will have all these builds I'm going to show pinned somewhere down below. And without explaining all of this right away, we're just going to show the single target build, and then I'm going to explain how to play it very briefly before we go into more depth later. Also, I want to say that this is going to be primarily PvE focused today. There's going to be a little bit of PvP talk towards the end, but for the most part, this is for raiding and Mythic Plus and stuff. So anyway, jumping right into the single target build, this is what you're going to see pretty much everybody running, with some slight deviation in the talents up top here. There are options. You don't have to, it's not as cookie cutter as some people would make you believe. But this side in the Arms Warrior tree, this is pretty much standard what we're going to be running. And this build is very much a bleed focus build. And here I am already rambling. So how to demonstrate and show off this build today is it's more of a priority system than an actual rotation. We need to keep Rend up and Deep Wounds up as much as possible, since this is all bleed focused. And going into that, we're going to charge in, put up our Rend first, and then we're going to use our cooldowns, if you have them available, of course, being Avatar and Colossus Smash at the same time. And then we're going to Dragon Roar, Thunderous Roar these days, and apply that big bleed during our cooldown window there. And then we're going to immediately use Skull Splitter, and this is going to burn off our Rend and Deep Wounds within that Colossus Smash window. So this should be during the Recklessness proc that we get off of this talent as well. So hopefully you get a big value crit out of that. And then immediately afterwards, we're going to reapply Rend, even though it's during a CS window, and Rend's not generally good to do that, but these days we will be. And then Mortal Strike to follow up to reapply Deep Wounds. And then it's either Overpower or Slam during our Colossus Smash window. Generally speaking, though, we have a lot of rage to play with this expansion, so Slam is going to be the predominant caster during CS. We're only going to be using Overpower if you're under 70 rage, and because of this talent, we have a bigger rage pool to play with, being 130, so you can kind of get away with, leaving a bigger rage bar than in the past. And then we're going to be Mortal Striking off cooldown to get as big of a Test of Might buff as we possibly can during that Colossus Smash window. And I realize this is supposed to be the short version. So, outside of all that, Execute phase. Basically, Execute is going to be the priority spender during the Execute phase, of course. With the Massacre talent, it's going to be at 35%. And the way this changes is you're never going to cast Slam during it. You're still going to reapply Rend right before it falls off to keep up that bleed, as well as Mortal Striking if Deep Wounds is ever about to fall off. But generally speaking, you're not going to have to worry about that because of this talent being Executioner's Precision. That's going to make Mortal Strike do more damage with 2 stacks of Execute on the target. And with high haste and gear and raid consumables and stuff, you probably get in 3, definitely 2 executes in between windows before you'll have to reapply Mortal Strike anyway if it's off cooldown. And Overpower, once again, is just used as a filler when you're low on rage. And that same rule still applies that you would do this below 70 rage to use Overpower. But considering the Execute refunds a ton of rage, it's a little bit more fluctuating than that. So even if you have a little bit less, like 50, you could still get away with executing and not put up too much of a fuss about it, because you want to get up your Juggernaut stacks as fast as possible also during Execute phase. We're still going to be doing the Skull Splitter combo during Execute phase, so you would still fit that in, and your cooldowns would line up normally. But anyway, let's demonstrate this real quick. We're going to charge in, put up our Rend, use our cooldowns here, put up Thunderous Roar, Skull Splitter, into reapplying Rend, into Mortal Strike, and then it's slamming during the CS window. We'll throw in an Overpower there because we were below 70 rage. But as CS is about to fall off, You want to get in that last little slam just to get up as big of a test of might buff as you can, being about 21% at this moment in this gear. We're reapplying Rend right before it falls off, and then even if Skull Splitter comes back up here, we're going to hold it to only use Skull Splitter with our Colossus Smash window. So with haste and the way anger management works, sometimes these cooldowns can get a little bit unaligned, but you want to save them, or well, save Skull Splitter rather, to line up within the Colossus Smash window. And after that point, it's make sure that you're reapplying Rend roughly right before Colossus Smash. If it's a global or two off, it's not a big deal, but you would reapply Rend into the Colossus Smash, into Skull Splitter, Rend, Mortal Strike, etc. And unlike in the past, we're not really using Skull Splitter to generate rage, even though it still does. It's mostly just to burn off our Rend and Deep Wounds with the Tide of Blood talent here for a big burst of damage within that Colossus Smash window, is the basic idea behind it. And then it's just burning as much rage, or keeping that flow up with Overpower to get our CS back during single target, using it on cooldown. And yeah, basically you want to, when Avatar and Thunder Sword come back up, you do want to wait and align those with Colossus Smash when it comes back up. So with a lot of gear with anger management, one thing I've found that can happen is Colossus Smash will come up, and these will be up in like 12 seconds or something. And this has a 45-second cooldown. You can either wait 12 seconds and not use Colossus Smash, or you can go ahead and throw it and try to line these back up. If you're going into like a Bloodlust phase, or you have a haste proc from a weapon enchant, for example, or something like that, I would say go ahead and use the Colossus Smash and then try to reset it as fast as possible, especially if it's during execute phase. It's going to come back really fast, under 30 seconds. So you don't necessarily hold Colossus Smash, but you do hold these cooldowns for Colossus Smash. And then line all that up, especially going into an execute phase, you want to have Avatar and everything burning for that. But anyway, that's pretty much the single target in the shorthand version, or the longhand, I guess, in this case. And we're going to go over another single target build that you can play that doesn't focus on bleed so much. It uses procs and buffs Overpower. Now, this build, I wouldn't really recommend right now for raiding because of the way that it anti-synergizes with anger management in a lot of ways, and the execute phase itself. But you can play it if you really don't like managing Rend and Skull Splitter and doing the whole bleed dance thing. And even, you know, if you're just coming back to the game, for example, maybe this one's a little bit more forgiving for you to play. It's also getting buffed next patch. I don't want to talk too much about next patch yet, but this might end up being pretty good. It's not terrible right now, so you can try it. But anyway, getting into that, we're playing this row of talents rather than these, and we're going to go over these later, but the general way we're going to play this is Mortal Strike can reset itself, and Overpower can also reset Mortal Strike. So instead of focusing so much on slamming during our Colossus Smash window for the Test of Might buff, we're going to be using a lot of Overpowers, and since we have Dreadnought with this build, we have 2 charges of it. And it's a little bit of a feel-out kind of rotation. It's generally speaking the exact same. You're going to put up Rend all the time, you know, in Deep Wounds, but you're not going to be burning it off of Skull Splitter because we don't have that anymore. So our opener is going to look similar with cooldowns, and then instead of burning off with Skull Splitter, you're just going to be spamming Slam and Mortal Strike to get up that Test of Might buff with throwing in Overpowers. So since we have 2 charges of this, generally speaking, you're going to want 1 charge always rotating on cooldown, if not both, and Mortal Striking on cooldown whenever it comes up. And if you're questioning on either of these 2 builds, Mortal Strike on cooldown whenever it comes up, you want to be having Rage for that, not, you know, waiting for an Overpower if it's there. So you can overcap on Rage with this build, which is why it's a little bit unsynergistic with anger management, but I would say that it's still better to burn off a charge at least of Overpower to buff your Mortal Strike, and since Overpower is getting double buffed by these talents. So anyway, to show off this build really quick, we're going to go in, Rend, put up our cooldowns, Thunderous Roar, Mortal Strike, and we're going to burn off 1 Overpower and then Slam here. Burn off another Overpower into Mortal Strike, and as you can see, we're getting a ton of procs, and burning that off. And as you look here, our Test of Might buff actually is pretty similar with this build at the moment. Obviously, with raid buffs, it's a little bit different. Another thing is that the other build, the Bleed build, is going to synergize better once it gets more gear. Just because of haste values is going to allow you to spend off a lot more rage. And also, we got a Moral Strike proc here, and it's a really fun build because it's very proc dependent. Reapplying our Rend, and we still have a pretty similar Test of Might buff, even with this build. Now, this build in lower gear values, you might see some more success with, actually. But generally speaking, I would still recommend you get used to the Bleed build for now, because of the way that it synergizes really well with the Execute phase, because you're spending off so much rage with this to get big, juicy Test of Might buffs and anger management. And you still do that with this build, but you're trying to weave in Overpowers, and Overpower is only buffing Mortal Strike in this case, so it's a little bit anti-synergistic at the end of the fight. At the top end, though, you would probably see a little bit more success with this if you're doing, like, early progression on something, maybe. But generally speaking, I would play the Rend build. Anyway, moving on to the Cleave build, which, as we're switching talents here, brings up 1 point. The arms is in a very awkward spot right now until the next 0.5 patch, and that's we basically have to specialize in either pure single targets or pure AoE. There's not really a good hybrid build, I'll go over that much later, that we can kind of do, but this is generally going to be our AoE build for Mythic Plus dungeons or any heavy AoE raid fights. And you can obviously, for a raid fight, swap out like Stormbolt, for something else, so you're not wasting points. But for Mythic Plus, you can do something like this. There are some options. We'll go over talents later. But generally, this is going to be Bleed-based as well, but we're going to be relying on Blade Storm and Whirlwind for a huge portion of our damage, as well as Cleave. And the way this is going to work is you still have Avatar, but we have Warbreaker, Thunderous Roar now. And this talent is very important. Storm of Swords puts cooldown on Whirlwind, as well as Hurricane here, and Merciless Bone Grinder, which both buff Whirlwind after Blade Storm, and it also buffs Cleave. So this is going to just be focused on AoE damage. You're not going to do a ton of single target damage. That's not what it's designed for. But we got this pack of 5 targets over here. Generally speaking, with cooldowns up, or briefly without cooldowns, you're going to Cleave on cooldown, or as it comes up, which is basically every other global because of the Reaping Swings talent, filling in with Overpower, Sweeping Strikes to get up Overpower's Dreadnought lines, and then cleaving and whirlwinding when you have the rage to spend for its, with standard cooldowns. But anyway, jumping into how we actually open with like a big burst pull on Mythic Plus, and these things aren't going to die immediately. You're going to go in, Thunderclap immediately, to put up our Rend on everything, or 5 targets at least, with the Blood and Thunder talent here. And then as soon as Thunderclap is up and Rend's on these guys, we're going to Avatar, and that's going to proc Blade Storm from this talent. And that's also going to stack up our Hurricane and give us our Merciless Bone Grinder buff afterwards. Mostly we want this Hurricane talent to be going. That's why I'm going to be using Avatar with that proc Blade Storm before I'm even Warbreakering. And then after that, we're going to immediately Warbreaker to apply our Colossus Smash to 5 targets into Thunderous Roar. And the idea behind it is we want our Hurricane buff, which is 30% strength buff after our Blade Storm, to buff the entire duration of Thunderous Roar's bleed, because the bleed off Thunderous Roar is a lot of burst damage. So we're going to do that into Thunderous Roar, and then we're going to Cleave into Whirlwind, into Cleave, and then immediately Blade Storm again. And that's ideally with enough haste. You'll Blade Storm in the last second that your Hurricane buff is about to fall off, but if you hard cast Blade Storm again, it's going to maintain its 6 stacks of the buff and not fall off during that entire channel. That way, we have all 6 stacks throughout the entire duration that Thunderous Roar is ticking down, and we still fit in that second Blade Storm within the Warbreaker window. And then immediately outside of the Blade Storm, we're going to Cleave into Whirlwind, into Cleave, and we're going to use as many Cleaves as we can during this Merciless Bone Grinder buff for that increased damage on it. And during that dance between cleaving and other GCDs, you're going to make sure that Rend doesn't fall off with Thunderclap. Now, even though Thunderclap is AoE, we're not going to use it as an AoE attack per se. It's only to reapply Rend to as many targets as we can. So if you have a free global and you're wondering what to press there, it'd be better to hit an overpower, or better yet, hit sweeping strikes beforehand. That way your next overpower casts are going to be proccing 2 Dreadnought lines for continued AoE damage. So, yeah, that was a lot to take in, I'm sure. So we're going to go ahead and demonstrate this here real quick. Charge in, Thunderclap, and immediately Blade Storm with our Avatar proc into Warbreaker, into Thunderous Roar, Cleave, Whirlwind, Cleave, into Hardcast Blade Storm. We maintain our Hurricane stacks up here. Then we'll Cleave. I'm going to throw in an Overpower here. Cleave, Whirlwind, reapply Rend into Cleave, and we have one more global that we can cleave with our Merciless Bone Grinder buff. And now we're outside of the CD window. We're going to throw up a Sweeping Strikes here, and Warbreaker's about to come back up. We're going to go ahead and throw that and use our big juicy Whirlwind during that window, which also is going to help reset our cooldown because of anger management. And then it's just managing Cleave in as many target situations as possible, and Sweeping Strikes. Now this is for 5 targets and above, or 4 targets and above, really. What if you're hitting 2 targets or 3 targets? If it's a 2 or 3 target situation, instead of cleaving, you're going to prioritize Mortal Strike with Sweeping Strikes up in those situations, and Execute if it's during the Execute phase of those targets' health. And then it's just like your single target rotation priority. You would Execute and Mortal Strike to maintain deep wounds, but also if you have a couple of Overpower buffs, I would say Mortal Strike with Sweeping Strikes up. Just because you're not using Executioner's Precision, a double-stacked Overpowered Mortal Strike is still going to hit harder than an Execute, for example, in AoE, because we're not having all these AoE, or we don't have Juggernaut, so it's not buffing the AoE, or the damage of Execute, my bad. So that's the quick version, I guess, of how to play arms at the moment in the AoE and single target builds. And now we're going to go into a little bit more depth of everything. Nothing's going to change on the rotational side. Just going to go over the talents and explain a bit some nuance and synergies and stuff. So if you want to stick around, feel free to. There is one thing I do want to mention about the AoE build before I forget about it. The rotation I did for Burst going into Avatar and Warbreaker is generally what you would do in a single target situation as well. So say you're fighting a boss that spawns a bunch of ads, so you're playing the AoE build, but it's single target at the beginning. You would go in and do the same thing that I just did, but replacing Cleave with Mortal Strike. You would still use that Giga-Juiced Whirlwind during single target with this build. But another situation that can come up is, say you're doing a lower Mythic Plus key, and a target pack like this is going to die too fast. It's going to die before you go through all of your cooldowns. In which case, I would recommend, instead of using your hard-casted Blade Storm at the end of, or, you know, like you normally would, you would save it and kind of break up these 2 Blade Storms, because things are going to die before, like, Thundershore falls off over 16 seconds. In which case, I would charge in, put up Rend with Thunderclap, Warbreaker first, into Thunderous Roar, and then immediately Avatar, basically in the same global. And that's going to not have the Avatar buff on the Thunderous Roar's first hit. However, you're going to get the buff from that on the bleed duration and the Blade Storm channel within the Warbreaker itself. And that's going to load more of the damage on the front end for bursting down a pack that you know is going to die quickly. And we just want to buff out as much of Thunderous Roar with Warbreaker in that situation, rather than worrying about stacking up Hurricane beforehand. So, quickly, to show that off, we're going to put up that into Thunderous Roar, into Avatar, and then you're still going to prioritize Cleave and Whirlwind afterwards for your Merciless Bone Grinder buff here. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And then if the pack's about to die, I would just save that second Blade Storm, and since we're resetting Warbreaker quickly anyway by spending Rage, in the next pack, then I would just Warbreaker, Blade Storm, and, you know, use your 2 Cleave and Whirlwind abilities buffed afterwards to buff those. But anyway, that's the way you would play the AoE build. We're going to move back here to... Okay, I should probably talk next about a hybrid build, actually. It's not great. There's multiple ways you can go about it, and it really depends on the boss fight. There's not like one quick build that just works on everything, I wouldn't say. So, for example, this is what I've been testing out on Razageth at the moment, Heroic. It's okay. I'm probably going to adjust this some, so don't take it as gospel at the moment. But the idea being that we still want a predominantly single-target focus build that's going to buff our bleeds down this tree and the execute talents on this side of the tree, but picking up a little bit of cleave with literally cleave and Storm of Swords and Sweeping Strikes. And also in the warrior tree, we're picking up Thunderclap to apply rend off everything, but still buffing some other things. Speaking of which, if you're playing a hybrid build kind of like this, and you see these talents that buff Slam a lot, and Whirlwind, Barbaric Training, and Crushing Force, if you're playing like the AoE build, or the fight you're going into that requires a hybrid build has a lot of AoE, then don't feel too bad about giving up these Slam talents, because Slam ends up not being a ton of your overall damage anyway, especially if you're going to be, cleaving a lot in its place. So you can give up some of those. But there's another situation where you wouldn't want cleave per se. I'm trying to think of a fight here that would be a good example. The spider boss in the new raid is a good example. There's a ton of little ads, right? But it's not enough. They don't live long enough that you're going to spec into AoE. But there is the big spider, so you're going to want Sweeping Strikes. So in that situation, what I would do is we're going to drop these two talents. And if you're going like more single target focused, we would still pick up Skull Splitter and Tide of Blood, and then just drop Fatality, because Fatality is good, but it doesn't end up being a ton of your overall damage, especially if you can hit two targets. I would rather have Sweeping Strikes, cleave that big spider and get in more executes potentially on that spider, which sweep onto the boss. Alternatively, you could drop a talent in Bloodborne and keep Fatality, but if you're not actually hitting the boss for most of the time with Mortal Strikes, you're not going to be stacking this up, and I would rather have the bleed damage than the fatality damage, because fatality ends up being like 3 to 5% of your overall at the end of a single target boss fight anyway. So I would rather have Bloodborne, especially on something like the Spider boss, where we would just take Sweeping Strikes on the arm side of the tree. Oh, and swapping over to Warbreaker too, so we can clip as many ads as possible. And you would play this like the single target build, but we would also pick up Thunderclap. We'd shuffle a few things around over here and pick up Thunderclap, still buffing up Slam. You could alternatively drop a point in this, or you wouldn't have Wrecking Throw for most bosses. Wrecking Throw is just for Razageth. You would still take Overwhelming Rage here, but swapping up a few talents just to pick up this, that way when there's a ton of those like little spiders behind you, you're not caring about actually hitting them. You just want to throw up a Thunderclap to put rend on as many of them as possible, and then continue to single target the boss and basically ignore that they're there other than putting rend up. And rend ends up being a ton of your damage anyway with these bleed talents, so you can do that. Another trick that you can do with Sweeping Strikes and the rend build here is Skull Splitter will actually bleed out your target with Sweeping Strikes. If you hit two things, it's going to burn off rend and deep wounds on two targets, so I can show you that real quick here. So if we Sweeping Strikes and put up rend on both of these, okay, it's kind of awkward with this. Both of these guys, hopefully that hit both, there we go. And then we burn our Colossus Smash into Skull Splitter. That's going to burn off those dots and which one of these targets, it hit that one for some reason, but you get the idea. It'll burn it off on two targets, provided you're close enough. Sweeping Strikes' range has always been kind of weird, and it's even weirder now with Skull Splitter doing things, the way it interacts. But anyway, going over some of the other talents here, the overpowered talents, they're going to get buffed next patch, so I'm going to make another video going over the changes to that and seeing how things... And also next patch, we're also going to be getting a few more connection lines in our talent tree, so it's going to be easier to not be so specialized and be able to actually multi-class in a way with, AoE and single target. Gear, enchants, stuff like that. We want Crit Haste, our two predominantly best stats right now. I obviously have a ton of crit at the moment. You want to shoot for like 25, 20, I'd say. And then Mastery Verse aren't bad as arms, but generally speaking, you're going to want more crit haste. Don't feel too bad if you get a bunch of mastery on stuff too. It'll end up scaling really well once you hit the soft breakpoints for these. But you also, the tier set is going to, it synergizes really well with high crit value. So that's the reason why having a ton of crit, I don't think is a very bad thing ever, especially in AoE. The tier set is just going to get even better. Speaking of which, the tier set does swap up our cleave rotation ever so slightly, I'd say. You can still play it the exact same way that I just went over, but when you have the 4 set, I don't have the 4 set yet, but when you have it, you can throw in a cleave to potentially buff your burst window by 5% for that 6 seconds. It's not a very long buff, but it's still a buff. And if you have a high crit value, I'd say it's worth fishing for. And what you would do in like the standard cleave build is you would open the same way with this, but instead of going into Warbreaker, you would cleave first to try and fish for that tier set proc into the standard rotation after that point. But otherwise, the tier set doesn't really change up how we play the game in any way. It's just a flat damage bonus, other than in that specific situation. I would also recommend, if you're new coming back to the game, to pick up the Elemental Lariat. Unless this thing gets nerfed, which it possibly could. I don't know. There'd be a lot of mad people if it does, because it costs so much. But this is probably the best piece of crafted gear we can get right now. It's a huge stat bonus. It is affecting the smaller stat of your gems if you're running these multi-statted gems like I am, I believe, unless this gets hot patched or something. So these 70 crit, 33 haste gems, this proc is going to give me haste, not the crit proc, so plan accordingly. I would still recommend you get these gems, though, because it's more overall stat than just getting like the 88 crit gems. And as I said before, crit haste are both very valuable for arms. Haste reducing the cooldown on several of our abilities, including Whirlwind. So yeah, pretty good. And I think that's pretty much all I need to go over right now for the PvE side of things. This is already going way too long. I did want to mention a macro real quick. There is a stance macro, if I can find the thing. Where did I hide it? Ah, here it is. This macro right here. This puts both of your stances, being battle and defensive stance, into one button again like it was previously. If you don't want to have 2 separate keybinds, I'll bring it up on screen here again real quick. This macro, when you make it, you can put it on one button, and then that single button press will just toggle between the 2 stances. That way you don't have to have 2 separate keybinds. So if I'm just pressing my stance button over here, even if I'm spamming it, it's not going to turn off a stance like you could accidentally do beforehand. It's just going to swap between the 2. Highly recommend that. And then on top of that, there is another macro, this one right here, that I would recommend for PvP, actually, if you're using it. Well, minus this trinket in here, you don't really need that. But this is a cast sequence macro that's basically going to throw Spear of Bastion on the ground and then immediately cast Avatar afterwards. So you can look at that. But speaking of which, very briefly talking about PvP, I'm probably going to do a separate video to go into a bit more detail on this. Basically, in PvP, you obviously want versatility. You know, get a full set of PvP gear from the Honor Vendor and Conquest and stuff. Versus your best, I would say crit is going to end up being the second best stat still, because eventually you'll be able to use your tier set in PvP if you're going for that. And this is the build that I'm running currently. Arms is, with a few changes here and there, Arms' biggest weakness at the moment is that it's very squishy. We don't have a ton of survivability. So basically every single defensive healing talent we can take, you're going to take it. You're going to want to take it anyway. Pain and Gain, Bitter Immunity, as much as I don't like Bitter Immunity, Legion Strikes, all of these we're going to grab. I'm even grabbing both of these talents, Stormwall and Fueled by Violence. You could drop Stormwall, you know, if you're fighting Double Caster, for example, and pick up something else. But it'll proc even when you're parrying without Diveth Sword up. So if you parry like a pet, for example, just naturally, you'll get this heal proc. So it's still really useful most of the time. Outside of that, I'm playing Spear of Bastion and the Bladestorm talent. And basically the idea behind this build is we want big burst goes with Bladestorm, and we're playing Unhinged as well to get free Mortal Strikes during our Bladestorm window. And it hasn't changed from the past. If you pop Sweeping Strikes before you Bladestorm, it will cleave these 2 free Mortal Strikes in that window. And that includes the Avatar proc Bladestorm. So you can get 4 potential free Mortal Strikes during this, and another 4 from hard casting it during a burst go. It's a lot of Mortal Strikes if you can catch 2 targets in it. And that's how Spear of Bastion helps set that up, is to keep people there for that duration so you can get in as much cleave damage pressure as possible. And we take the Elysian Might talent to extend that, and Warbreaker, of course. In for the kill just synergizes a bit better with Bladestorm in, AoE situations, so we're taking that. You could drop Piercing Verdict. I like it for the burst. You could swap out to a few other things. Once again, like I mentioned earlier, I don't feel bad about dropping a lot of these slam talents because it doesn't end up doing a ton of your damage anyway. You're barely going to be pressing it in Arena, for example. So you'd much rather have something like Bitter Immunity, even though it's a really long cooldown and it doesn't do a whole lot. But it's better than nothing, as how squishy we are. And you might be wondering why not play Skull Splitter and Tide of Blood and everything in Arena, and that's because a lot of the bleed talents are nerfed in PvP. Rend is nerfed by 15%, so it loses value with Tide of Blood. You could still run it, like as this build is right here. I am still running Rend with Bloodborne at least, just for a little bit of extra bleed pressure. But if you go down to like Bloodletting is a really good talent for PvE. It's cut in half in PvP. It's 3 seconds longer, and the crit chance is reduced. It's just not as much value. But on top of that, Sharpened Blades is also nerfed in PvP by 50%, so it's only 5%. And Executioner's Precision is also nerfed by 50%. But since the recent buffs to Mortal Strike and Execute, most of our damage is within those chunks anyway. So the idea was you want to buff Mortal Strike and Execute as much as possible, even though it's gimped a little bit, because the baseline Mortal Strikes still hit really hard, and with Unhinged, it's a lot of burst potential. The other build that I would highly recommend playing around with if you don't like managing Rend, which is still really good, is you can drop Blood Surge and pick up Improved Overpower, and pick up Exhilarating Blows and Dreadnought, and then you can go down here. I don't need to respec all this. You can go down here into Battlelord to buff this, and next patch, when these talents get buffed, and they're going to buff the Dreadnought lines, this is probably what I would recommend playing then for PvP. It's already really good. So the only reason why you might want to play like Rend and Bloodborne still is if you're fighting something that's going to be kiting you constantly, so you can have that extra little bit of pressure from the bleeds on it. Also, Overpower is great, but you're not pressing it a ton, because we have such good rage management anyway. You're going to be Mortal Striking, all the time. So the Overpower buffs are nice, but technically, if you were to Rend before you did your big burst go, the Rend during that burst window would be better burst than having Overpower buffs, because they're not doing anything during that window. So it's very, spec dependence and who you're playing with and how you want to set up goes for Arena and whatnot. But anyway, what I would demonstrate that, is if there was 2 targets, it's very simple. We're just going to get up Rend on a couple of targets and then go into our Bladestorm combo, which would be sweep, put up our Rend, drop our Warbreaker, and use their Spear macro, which is going to throw down Spear and immediately Avatar. We're going to immediately Mortal Strike out of that just to get another cast, and then immediately go back into Bladestorm just to use up as much of that Sweeping Strikes window as we can for those 2 free Unhinged Mortal Strikes during that as well. And these 2 targets are going to take potentially like 10 Mortal Strikes within that burst window. Obviously, you could set it up, with a Mortal Strike at the very beginning too and add to it, etc. But you only got 15 seconds with Sweeping Strikes to get that all done. Anyway, that droned on a bit longer than I anticipated. I think we're going to cut it there today, folks. If you made it this long, thank you so much for watching. Merry Christmas. Leave any comments, questions down below, and especially if you made it this far, please show the video some love. Really appreciate it. Subscribe for more content. We're going to be doing a ton of other things coming up on the channel in the new year. But yeah, have a good new year if I don't see you again, and take it easy. I'll see you next time. Peace.